but that doesn't mean there isn't any benefit. So
Oh, yeah.
firstly, with regard to strength itself, there's definitely there's more long-term thought that needs to go into planning for like strength, as in for sport, in the sense of like powerlifting, Olympic weightlifting, strongman, Highland Games, etc. So if you compete in a strength sport, then of course periodization, or better, just long-term thinking and planning, that becomes more important for those, because you've got deadlines. Okay, you've got times at which specific components of fitness need to be maximized, and therefore that needs to be thought about. However, for most people, it's not really that important, because you don't need to exploit any one component of fitness at a given point in time. If you're trying to build muscle building is primarily just a side effect of long-term training. Okay, it's a side effect of performing training that's relatively close to failure at high enough volumes that you can tolerate and recover from, with exercises that are appropriate for the muscles you're trying to train. You do that for long enough in a calorie surplus with sufficient protein, and you're going to, gain muscle. Okay, that obviously makes it sound very easy, and it's not easy, but it's simple in theory. There's actually not that much complexity to planning hypertrophy training. It's more so the consistency and actually committing to it. Okay, the bottlenecks to progress with hypertrophy training are far more likely to be a lack of commitment to the calorie surplus in particular. I think people definitely struggle with that, and also injury. Okay, that's a huge one, because one of the things that acts as a huge bottleneck is the fact that people end up in a position where they're unable to do the volume required for them to continue gaining muscle, especially as advanced lifters, because they get to a point where when they do more than, let's say, 15 sets, their shoulder just starts getting at them, and they can no longer take themselves close to muscular failure. So they're kind of the real bottlenecks when it comes to hypertrophy training. So when you're planning training, then over the long term, you're trying to kind of manage those things. And that's one of the main things. You want to foster consistency, which is actually done through some form of periodization. And that's kind of the key point probably that will emerge from the end of this podcast, that although there's no specific periodization model that's required, having people work in different rep ranges, changing exercises over time, overall just having some sort of variation is really, really important for the sake of interest, because you could probably do the same exercises in the same rep ranges for your entire life and make good progress. That'd be great. But God, that's hard to commit to. Some people do that. There's definitely some people that just show up to the gym like clockwork every day, do the same exercises, 3 sets of 10, 5 sets of 5, keep showing up, add weight when they can, and they make great progress because at least they've got that consistency in place. But that's not most people.
Yeah, but even them, they periodize their training, and they might not have it laid out, but they do. They'll be like, all right, cool. Like say 5x5, for example, because they're probably the most consistent, most whatever across the board. They're like, I go to the gym 3 times per week and I do 5x5,
Yeah.
With them, they'll be like, okay, no, I'm actually peeling the weight back now, and then I'm going to build it back up. Like that's periodization, that's just managing the load as a method of periodization, and it might not all be periodized together, but you've periodized your squat. It's like, this is the time I'm going to, unload the weight a little bit and then build it back, because the way I think of periodization, especially for we'll call them like the general population, it's basically fatigue management, stressor management, and then adaptation management, right? And with that, what I mean is, like, let's say we're doing some sort of periodization structure so that we can manage the amount of fatigue that someone is feeling at a given time, right? So that's why we're maybe using RPE or reps in reserve, or managing the amount of volume that's being done on a certain workout or a certain week or a certain month or whatever, right? We're managing that overall fatigue. We might be at a stage where we're kind of going, okay, we're not managing fatigue right now. We're actually trying to build up to see what is the level of fatigue that you can actually handle, right? And that goes in with the second point, where once we know that kind of fatigue ability, fatigue level, management, whatever, we can also start manipulating the stressor, right? And this comes in 2 forms. Again, like as we've talked about previously, like we can periodize the stressor that's being put on the body to then elicit the adaptation, which is again managing the adaptation that we want. Like we could be like, okay, well, actually for your goals, the stressor we need that's going to elicit the adaptation that we want is more aligned with like lower reps, right? But I know if you do lower reps for more than a month, your body starts being excessively fatigued, because we've actually just established that we actually tried that before. We actually did a month for you of lower reps, and all of a sudden you're like, I feel like shit, my sleep has gone to shit, I'm starting to get a niggle in my shoulder, my hip, whatever happened, right? We're not able to manage that fatigue. So even though the stressor, we're like, okay, well, this is going to be the stressor that leads to the adaptation that we want, we now have to periodize our training so that we can actually, sometimes get a little bit of that stressor to get the adaptations, but then we do something else the other time, so that we're not like, we're still getting some of the adaptations, but we're not excessively fatigued. Like, for example, you might be a powerlifter and you're like, well, I only ever need to do 1 rep, so I'll just do 1 rep, but anyone who does just 1 rep, they probably don't do all that well in powerlifting, so you're basically managing your training, your periodization, so that you work on other fitness qualities, other adaptations, so that you can then do the stuff that actually leads to the progress that you actually want over time. So that's why we're periodizing our training. We're basically going, okay, well, we need to manage fatigue in some way. We need to manage the stressor that is being put on the body to elicit the adaptation. So in effect, we're trying to manage those 2 variables of fatigue and stressor to get the adaptation that we want, right? And in the context of just pure muscle building, and we'll call it body composition or whatever, like, we are basically trying to manipulate reps and sets, and we'll use sets as a proxy for overall volume. You could be doing like 20 sets per week for quads, for example, right? So we're manipulating those variables because, first of all, like Gary said, like, you want your client to be consistent. You want to be able to be consistent yourself. If you just said like, oh, we're just going to 10 sets for quads per week, they're all in the 8 rep range, we're doing that for the rest of your life, same exercises, same whatever, like, you're probably not going to enjoy training after like 16 weeks. You're going to be like, okay, just go into the gym and do the same thing again, right? Your fatigue is probably going to be higher because there's no like waving of the load over time. There's never any easier weeks or easier days or anything like that. So fatigue is probably a little bit higher. Again, also psychologically, it's just like, oh man, I have to go in. Like, if you talk, going back to that 5x5, you talk to anyone who does 5x5, they're like, yeah, man, like, I enjoy it, it gets the results, but man, I'm just so fatigued going into it, where I'm just like, I know the next workout I do, I have to try to add weight. It's just mentally very taxing, some people really like that, but once you're past the kind of like 200 kilo mark on squats and thinking of adding like, oh, I'll just add 1.25 kilos, like that's not enjoyable. Like, it's just not. So that's why we are periodizing. It's not to do with nothing really, actually, well, it is, but it's nothing really to do with like, some structure that we read in a study or some sort of like, oh, this is what the literature says we're doing it for, or whatever. We're basically just trying to manage fatigue, manage the stressor on the body, and then manage the adaptation that we actually want to achieve from doing that. Would you agree with that, Gary?
I would agree with that.